Hey guys, welcome back. It's Ripe again, back with more family drama stories. In this video, my entitled golden child brother got my wife pregnant and made my life hell for 20 plus years. Let's dive right into the video. The title XXL mega story starts like this. It is crazy how your whole life can change in an instant. One moment you think you have it all figured out, a loving wife, a successful career, a close relationship with your family, and the next everything comes crashing down around you. So that is what happened to me about 3 years ago. Let me back up a bit though and give you some context. Mike, my brother, and I grew up in a pretty typical middle-class family. Our parents were not rich, but they provided for us and we never really wanted for anything. The problem was though, from a young age it became clear that Mike was the favorite. He was 2 years older than me, athletic, outgoing and charismatic. I was more introverted and bookish. Our parents doted on Mike, praising his every accomplishment and brushing off his mistakes. Meanwhile, I felt like I could never quite measure up no matter what I did. Don't get me wrong, I love my brother, or at least I did. We were close growing up despite our differences. He would stand up for me when I got picked on at school. I would help him with his homework and college applications. We had our sibling rivalries and squabbles, but at the end of the day we had each other's backs. Or so I thought. So I met Sarah in college. She was smart, funny, kind, everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. We dated all through school and got married a couple years after graduation. Mike was my best man at the wedding. Sarah and I settled into a happy life together, both working corporate jobs and saving up to buy a house and start a family someday. Mike, meanwhile, was living the bachelor lifestyle, dating around and focusing on his career. He had always been a smooth talker and was quickly climbing the corporate ladder at the big tech company he worked for. Our parents constantly gushed about how successful he was becoming. I was doing well in my own career, but it never seemed to garner the same praise and attention. About 5 years into our marriage, Sarah and I decided we were ready to try for a baby. We were so excited to start a family together. Month after month went by with negative pregnancy tests. After a year of trying with no success, we went to a fertility specialist, and that is when we got the devastating news. I was infertile. The doctor said it was likely I would never be able to father biological children. I was crushed. Sarah was supportive, assuring me that we could look into other options like adoption or sperm donation, but I could tell she was disappointed too. We took some time to process the news and figure out our next steps. During that time though, Mike was actually a huge source of support. He would listen to me vent my frustrations and reassure me that I'd be an amazing dad no matter what. Looking back now, I realized that's probably when things started. Sarah and I were both vulnerable and Mike took advantage of that. He would come over to hang out often when I was working late. I thought he was just being a good brother and friend, keeping Sarah company while I was busy. I had no idea what was really going on behind my back though. It was about 6 months after we got the infertility news that my whole world imploded. I came home early from work one day hoping to surprise Sarah. Instead, I was the one who got a nasty surprise. I walked in to find Sarah and Mike in our bed together. The image is still seared into my brain. My wife and my brother, naked and sweaty, scrambling to cover themselves as I stood there in shock. I stormed out of the house in a daze. I could not process what I had just seen. My wife, my brother, how could they do this to me? I drove around aimlessly for hours, ignoring the constant calls and texts from both of them. When I finally went back home late that night, Sarah was waiting up for me, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "It was a mistake. It only happened a few times. I love you. Please forgive me." I was too numb to even respond. I grabbed some clothes and went to stay at a hotel. I needed time and space to think. Over the next few days, both Sarah and Mike bombarded me with calls, voicemails, and text messages begging for forgiveness. They swore it was just a brief fling, that it didn't mean anything. Sarah pleaded for another chance to save our marriage. Mike said he'd do anything to make it up to me. After about a week, I agreed to meet with Sarah to talk. As furious and heartbroken as I was, I did still love her. Maybe, just maybe, we could work through this and salvage our relationship. That glimmer of hope was extinguished as soon as Sarah dropped her next bombshell. And by the way, Ripe Stars, just to quickly chime in here, if you found your wife and your brother cheating on you, would you still try to work through this? Maybe I'm in the wrong here, but I would definitely not do that. I would go no contact instantly with both of them. Let me know your stance on this in the comments. Anyway, she said quietly, "There's something else you need to know." She was not meeting my eyes. "I'm pregnant, and it's Mike's." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The room started spinning. This could not be happening. But as Sarah went on to explain, the timing lined up. She was about 2 months along. Conception had likely happened during one of their encounters while I was working late. I walked out without another word. There was nothing left to say. My wife carrying my brother's child, it was too much to bear. I texted Sarah later that I wanted a divorce. She begged me to reconsider, to at least meet with her and Mike to discuss the situation. Against my better judgment, I agreed. That meeting turned out to be a huge mistake. Mike and Sarah had clearly been scheming behind my back. They tried to sell me on this twisted idea of all raising the baby together as some sort of unconventional family unit. Mike even had the audacity to suggest that I could be the kid's dad since I couldn't have biological children of my own. As if that would somehow make up for their betrayal. I exploded. I told him both exactly what I thought of their delusional plan and their despicable actions. I made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with either of them or the baby. Mike got angry, saying I was being selfish and unreasonable, that I should be grateful for the chance to be a father figure. I nearly punched him right there. "You're my brother," I spat. "You were supposed to have my back. Instead you stabbed me in it. As far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me." I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. That was the last time I spoke to either of them face to face for a long time. I moved out, got my own apartment, and threw myself into work to try to keep my mind off the pain and betrayal. I hired a ruthless divorce lawyer and made it clear that I wanted the split finalized as quickly as possible. Sarah tried to drag out the proceedings, still holding out, hoping that we could reconcile. But I was done. I wanted a clean break and to never see her again. We had a prenup, thankfully, so the financial aspect was not too messy. After a few months of back and forth, the divorce was finalized. I thought it would be the end of it. I was ready to move on and rebuild my life. But Mike and Sarah were not content to let me go so easily. They seemed to take my rejection of their happy family fantasy personally. And so began years of harassment, manipulation, and psychological torment. At first it was constant calls, texts, and emails. When I blocked their numbers, they would use other people's phones or make new email accounts. They would show up at my apartment or workplace unannounced. Mike even convinced our parents to try to guilt me into forgiving them and being part of the baby's life. "He's your nephew," my mom would plead. "Don't punish an innocent child for your brother's mistake." But it was not just a mistake, it was a deliberate betrayal that went on for months. And I knew if I let them back into my life, they would never stop trying to manipulate me. So I held firm in my decision to cut contact. As the baby's birth approached, the pressure intensified. Sarah sent me ultrasound photos and updates about the pregnancy. Mike left voicemails describing how excited he was to be a dad, but how he wished I could share in the joy. It was like they were going out of their way to twist a knife in my body. When my nephew was born, I got bombarded with photos and video clips from family members. My parents were over the moon about their first grandchild. They could not understand why I was not equally thrilled. And by the way, Ripe stars, these have to be the worst parents and worst siblings I've ever heard about. I feel so bad for OP. I felt like I was living in some alternate reality where everyone had gone insane. Over the next few years, Mike and Sarah's harassment ebbed and flowed. They would back off for a while and then launch a new campaign to try to force their way back into my life. They used my nephew as a pawn, sending me school photos and artwork he had made, telling me how much he wanted to meet his uncle. It was emotional blackmail, plain and simple. Meanwhile, they had poisoned most of my family and our shared friend group against me. They painted themselves as the victims, the star-crossed lovers who had made a mistake but were trying to make things right. I was of course the cruel, unforgiving brother who was denying an innocent child his uncle out of spite. I lost friendships over it. Even some of my cousins and other relatives took their side. I was portrayed as the bad guy for not being able to get over it and forgive them. I felt like my whole support system had been torn away. The only ones who stuck by me were my Aunt Carol and my best friend Jake. They could see through Mike and Sarah's manipulation and understood why I needed to maintain firm boundaries. The worst part was how it impacted my career and reputation. Mike and I worked in similar fields, so we had a lot of overlapping professional connections. He would even go out of his way to badmouth me to colleagues and potential employers. There were several job opportunities I missed out on because Mike had gotten to them first with his smear campaign. It got to the point where I dreaded any social or professional event knowing Mike might show up and cause a scene. He seemed to delight in ambushing me in public, trying to force a confrontation. I did my best to ignore him and walk away, but it was draining. I started to feel paranoid, always looking over my shoulder. The toxic situation took a major toll on my mental health. I struggled with depression and anxiety, I had trouble sleeping and lost my appetite. Some days it was a struggle just to get out of bed and go to work. I started seeing a therapist, which helped a bit, but I still felt trapped in this nightmare that Mike and Sarah had created. I knew I needed to make a change. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge and miserable, so I started formulating a plan. It would take time and patience, but I was determined to take back control of my life and get revenge on the two people who had destroyed it. My first step was gathering evidence. I started meticulously documenting every instance of harassment and defamation, every unwanted contact, every manipulative message, every time Mike sabotaged a job prospect. I saved emails, recorded phone calls in accordance with local laws, and got written statements from witnesses when possible. I also did some digging into Mike's professional life. Through some industry contacts, I learned that he had been engaging in some shady business practices at work, nothing outright illegal, but definitely unethical and against company policy. He had been cooking the books to inflate his performance numbers and taking credit for other people's work. Classic Mike, always needing to be the star. Armed with this information, I was ready to fight back, but I knew I had to be smart about it. Mike and Sarah had spent years painting me as the unstable, vindictive one. If I lashed out emotionally, it would only reinforce that narrative. I needed to be calm, calculated, and have all my ducks in a row. The opportunity came when I heard through the grapevine that Mike was up for a big promotion at work. It would mean a significant pay bump and a high-profile leadership role. His ego was no doubt already swelling at the prospect. I knew it was time to burst his bubble. I compiled all the evidence of his workplace misconduct into a detailed report, then I sent it anonymously to the HR department and board of directors at his company. I made sure to frame it as coming from a concerned employee, not a jealous brother. The effect was like a bomb going off. Within days, Mike was put on administrative leave pending an investigation. He was blindsided. He had always been able to charm his way out of trouble before, but the evidence this time was too thorough and too damning. After a few weeks, he was fired for cause. Mike was livid. He knew I had to be behind it somehow, but he couldn't prove it. He showed up at my apartment in a rage, pounding on the door and shouting threats. I calmly recorded the whole thing on my phone and then called the police to report his unhinged behavior. When they arrived, Mike tried to spin some story about me framing him at work. The officers were not buying it, and they gave him a stern warning about harassment and trespassing. With Mike's career in shambles, I moved on to phase 2 of my plan, exposing their lies and manipulations to our family and friends. I knew they would never believe me if I just told my side of the story, so instead I let Mike and Sarah hang themselves with their own words and actions. I set up a group text with our parents, siblings and closest family friends, then I sent a message saying that I was finally ready to reconcile and wanted to meet to discuss how we could all move forward as a family. Mike and Sarah's responses were gleeful. They started gushing about how happy they were that I'd finally come around, how they knew that I would see reason eventually, and then I dropped the bomb. I told them I'd been diagnosed with a terminal illness and only had months to live. I said that's why I wanted to make amends before it was too late. It was a terrible lie, I know, but I needed to see how they would react. And sure enough, Mike and Sarah's true colors came out. Instead of expressing shock or concern, they immediately launched into how this was the perfect opportunity for me to sign over my assets to them and my nephew. They talked about how I could do the right thing and make up for lost time by leaving everything to their son. It was gross, and I let that charade go on for a bit, screenshotting their greedy, manipulative messages. Then I revealed the truth. There was no terminal diagnosis. I had made it up to expose their true motives. I shared all the screenshots in the group chat, letting our family and friends see for themselves how Mike and Sarah really operated. The fallout was swift and severe. Our parents were horrified. They'd always taken Mike's side, believing his claims that he and Sarah were just trying to make things right. Now they saw that it was all a calculated manipulation. Mike and Sarah's masks had finally slipped. One by one, family members and old friends reached out to apologize for how they had treated me. They could finally see the full picture of what I'd been dealing with all these years. Mike and Sarah's carefully crafted narrative crumbled. They were exposed as the lying, scheming narcissists they truly were. To be honest, it was scary starting over in my late 30s, but also exhilarating. I threw myself into building a new life. I started my own small business consulting firm, drawing on my years of corporate experience. It was challenging but rewarding to be my own boss. I also started putting myself out there socially again. I joined some meetup groups to pursue hobbies I'd always been interested in, but never had time for before. I made new friends who knew me for who I was, not as Mike's bitter brother or Sarah's ex-husband. And then I met Alicia. She was unlike anyone I'd ever known before. We met at a local community garden where I'd started volunteering. She was passionate about sustainable living and had the most infectious laugh I'd ever heard. From our first conversation, I felt a connection I had not experienced in years. At first, I was hesitant to open up about my past. I was worried that once she knew my baggage, she would run for the hills. But Alicia was patient and understanding. She could tell that I'd been hurt before and did not push me to share until I was ready. When I finally told her the whole sordid story one night over dinner, her reaction amazed me. Instead of pitying me or treating me like I was damaged goods, she was angry on my behalf. She could not believe what Mike and Sarah had put me through. "You're incredibly strong," she told me, squeezing my hand. "To go through all that and still come out the other side with compassion and hope, that's remarkable." Her words touched me deeply. For so long, I'd been made to feel like I was the problem for not being able to forgive and forget. Alicia helped me see that my feelings were valid and that I had every right to protect myself from toxic people, even family. As our relationship grew, I marveled at how different it felt from what I had with Sarah. There was no manipulation, no walking on eggshells. Alicia and I communicated openly and honestly. We supported each other's goals and dreams. For the first time in years, I felt truly loved and appreciated for who I was. About a year into our relationship, Alicia and I decided to move in together. It was a big step, but it felt right. The day we finished unpacking the last box in our new apartment, I looked around at the life we were building together, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I had come so far from those dark days after discovering Mike and Sarah's betrayal, and my business was thriving too. Word-of-mouth referrals had led to a steady stream of clients, and I was able to hire a small team and even open a second office in a neighboring city. The work was challenging but fulfilling. I loved being able to help other small businesses grow and succeed. I still had moments where the past would creep up on me. Certain songs or smells would trigger memories of my life with Sarah, or I would have a nightmare about Mike showing up to ruin things again. But those moments became fewer and farther between as time went on. Alicia was always there to comfort me when I needed it, but she also encouraged me to continue therapy to work through my lingering trauma. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. I had not spoken to my parents much since exposing Mike and Sarah's lies. They had apologized profusely for not believing me all those years, but I still kept them at arm's length. Trust takes time to rebuild. "I have some news," my mom said hesitantly. "Your brother Mike, he's in the hospital. It's serious. The doctors are not sure if he's gonna make it." I felt a whirlwind of emotions: shock, anger, a tiny flicker of concern buried under years of pain. My mom went on to explain that Mike had fallen into a deep depression after losing everything. He had turned to alcohol and drugs to cope, and one night he had taken too much and OD'd. He was on life support. "I know you have every reason to hate him," my mom said, her voice cracking. "But I thought you should know, just in case you wanted to say goodbye." I thanked her for letting me know and hung up in a daze. Alicia found me sitting on the couch staring into space. When I told her what happened, she hugged me tightly. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. I thought long and hard. Part of me wanted to say, he made his bed, let him lie in it. I certainly did not owe Mike anything after how he had treated me, but another part of me knew that I would regret if I didn't at least go see him one last time, and in the end I decided to go to the hospital, not for Mike's sake, but for my own closure. Alicia offered to come with me for support, but I felt like this was something I needed to do alone. Walking into Mike's hospital room was surreal. He looked so small and frail, hooked up to all those machines. Nothing like the larger-than-life presence he had always had. Our parents were there too, looking haggard and grief-stricken. They seemed surprised but grateful to see me. I stood by Mike's bedside, taking in the shell of the man who had once been my brother, my best friend, before he betrayed me in the worst possible way. I felt no joy at seeing him brought so low, just a profound sadness for all that had been lost. I don't know if he could hear me, but I spoke to him anyway. I told him I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to let go of the anger and pain to move on with my life. I said goodbye to the brother I once knew and loved. As I turned to leave, my dad stopped me and said, "Son, I know we can never make up for how we failed you," he said, tears in his eyes, "but I hope someday you will give us a chance to try." I nodded, not ready to make any promises, but leaving the door open a crack. Mike passed away a few days later. I did not attend the funeral. Instead, Alicia and I took a long weekend trip to the beach. As I stood with my toes in the sand watching the waves roll in, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The final chapter of that painful part of my life had closed. I was free to fully embrace my new beginning. In the years since then, life has continued to blossom in ways I never could have imagined during those dark times. Alicia and I got married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by our closest friends, and we have talked about having kids someday, possibly through adoption. The idea of fatherhood no longer fills me with dread and pain like it once did. My business has grown beyond my wildest dreams. We now have offices in 3 states and a team of 50 employees. To make a super long story short, life is finally good. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I hope you enjoyed this XXL mega story, and please let me know in the comments what you think about these super long relationship stories. Do you like this type of content? Please share your feedback. And yeah guys, if you cannot get enough of my content, please don't forget to check out my podcast by searching for Ripe Stories on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts. Furthermore, you can find bonus content by going to patreon.com/ripeyoutube or by clicking the join button here on YouTube. For a small monthly fee, you will get access to dozens and dozens of exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.